we'll start with this one. Just as I uploaded my recent video, news broke that the Teofimo Lopez versus pay-per-view card went from being $19.99 back up to $49.99. The price point has changed once or twice since this fight was announced. It went from $60 to $50, all the way down to $20. Now it's $49.
Back up to $50? So unprofessional.
Altering the price point that much, it's going to confuse people. With just a little over 3 weeks' time to promote the fight, the price point for it having been altered so many times over such a long duration of time, it is going to confuse what people are aware of the fight. I don't even think that's a lot of people. The night of that fight, per tweet from T Street Controversy of Fight View 360 here on YouTube, he added a $50 Monday Night Pay-Per-View competing against Monday Night Football, #Wilder vs. Fury 3, 5 days later. Triller is a mess.
Just no other way to categorize it.
No other way to put it. When this fight was initially announced, the appeal of the card, as it were, at least for me, wasn't even the Lopez versus Kambosos Jr. fight. The only reason I was going to buy this thing at $60 a pop, back when it was $60 a pop, was due to the Frenchon Cruz versus Eileen Cedar-Ruz undisputed super middleweight title fight. That was
the only reason I was going to buy this thing.
A lot has happened since then. A lot has changed. Things got moved around, and we've talked about it here on the channel. But now, essentially, what you've got is Lopez versus Kambosos Jr. without the undisputed super middleweight title fight at a very similar price point to what it was several weeks ago. It's $50. Several weeks ago, it was about $60, and they dropped it. Then they dropped it again. Now, they've brought it back up to $50.
Without the undisputed super middleweight title fight.
I'll tell you now that Frenchon Cruz versus Eileen Cedar-Ruz has all the makings of what could be an even more competitive fight than Lopez versus Kambosos Jr. Most people ain't giving Kambosos much of a shot in that thing, and that's the main event. If you wanted to see a real dust-up, a real punch-up, a real Donnybrook, it would have been the Frenchon Cruz versus Eileen Cedar-Ruz fight.
Has all the makings of a knockdown, drag-out brawl.
I don't even know when we can expect to see that fight. I don't know if it's going to be rescheduled for some time before this year is out. I don't know if it'll be rescheduled to be on the undercard of this fight, the Lopez versus Kambosos Jr. fight. I don't know if that's back on, that kind of a situation. There is ticket info.
We didn't have that before.
We've got it now, and tickets range from $56 to $81 to $106 to $206 to $306 to be in attendance.
It's affordable.
$306 really ain't a lot of money.
Yeah, I spend more than that on jean jackets.
So I'll tell you something. The people over there at Triller, they can't hope to recoup the $6 million they've poured into this thing at the Live Gate. Now, this is set to go down at the Hulu Theater, which only houses about 5,600 people. And even if you sold every one of those tickets, every one of those 5,600 tickets,
at $306 a pop?
hypothetically speaking, that would only bring you a little over $1 million.
Remember, they poured $6 million into this fight.
Best case scenario, you make $1 million at the gate. You'd still have to rely on the pay-per-view to recoup the other $5 million that you poured into this thing. And in order to generate that, just generate it, might not even cover all the operational costs, you'd have to sell a minimum of 100,000 pay-per-view buys. In order to start making money, you'd have to sell well over that. So does Lopez versus Kambosos Jr. on a Monday night, competing with Monday Night Football and the same week as Wilder versus Fury 3. Can this fight hit that number?
At $50 a pop.
What boxing fans are planning on buying a pay-per-view that week might so decide to save their money for the Wilder versus Fury trilogy.
They might.
If they have to choose between Lopez versus Kambosos Jr. on Monday, $50 a pop, versus Wilder versus Fury 3 on Saturday at $80 a pop, they might decide to save their money for the Saturday night fight.
And if this pay-per-view don't do well,
it will be an indictment on Teofimo Lopez's marquee value. Moving forward, understand that he's doing all this to get at the kind of money that Devin Haney is already making on Matchroom.
That's right.
And he will have lost a year to do it. Devin Haney, in his last fight against Jorge Linares, he made $3 million. Teofimo Lopez stands to make
$4 million.
Although once Top Rank takes their percentage, takes their cut, which comes out to roughly $800,000, give or take, what Teofimo walks away with is just a little over $3 million. Not much more than Devin Haney makes, except it's costed him a lot more time. And I'm telling you now, I know Teofimo has racked up the very best win anywhere at or around these weights in unseating Vasyl Lomachenko, the pound-for-pound darling. But if this pay-per-view, if it don't perform well, it's going to be an indictment on his marquee value moving forward. And it's going to be that much harder to act like Mr. Big in the britches once the numbers are in. They've only got 3 weeks to promote this thing. Other news, per tweet from Keith Idek, PBC informed Top Rank before the initial purse bid was postponed that it was not interested in a joint pay-per-view venture for Crawford versus Porter. That remained true throughout the negotiation process, as Fox isn't involved in their fight November 20th. Strictly an ESPN pay-per-view show. Sounds a lot like the PBC wasn't even going to bother to put a bid in for this fight. It sounds like
a lot of narrative pushers owe Bob Arum an apology.
The people who want me and you to believe that Bob Arum and Top Rank were shielding Terence Crawford from the rest of the welterweights, the PBC's stable of fighters at 147 pounds. That's not the case. That's not so. Sean Porter is proving that he wants this fight because he's crossing the street to get it.
And Top Rank is footing the bill.
You may not have processed this yet because the news is fairly fresh, but this makes a lot of people look bad. Errol Spence Jr. among them, and Keith Thurman. I mean, even if Errol is incapacitated for the time being,
because of the situation with his retina,
even if he's not available to fight Terence Crawford, Keith Thurman has been. He has been for well over a year. What are you supposed to pay an inactive welterweight who's coming right off a loss?
Guys like Danny, guys like Keith.
Prima donnas, peacocks like those two. Guys that haven't had a solid victory in their column in years.
The guys that tell you everything's a fucking lowball.
I mean, doesn't this adequately show you who's been standing in the way of these fights? Who wants the fights and who don't want the fights? Who's making excuses and who ain't making excuses?
And Al Heyman can't get no credit for this one.
Because this isn't a joint venture, it's not a co-promotion, and the PBC are not involved. The most you can credit Al Heyman for doing, rather not doing, is not getting in the way. Not fucking up this fight the way he's fucked up a lot of fights over the years.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you could give him some credit for that.
For the last 3, 4 some odd years, you've had a lot of people quite content making excuses for these fighters to not do what Sean Porter is doing. And I know that in many ways for Sean Porter, this is a last resort, but at least he can say it's something he resorted to. Danny Garcia can't say that, Keith Thurman can't say that, and neither can Errol Spence Jr., who here today may very well be damaged goods, having deprived the fans of the fight they were asking him for years. For him, it may be a missed opportunity, an opportunity that Sean Porter is capitalizing on. And even if he doesn't get the W, even if he goes in there and gets smoked,
can't accuse Sean of ducking anybody.
And the fans, they remember stuff like that. They remember those kinds of fighters. This fall is set to be a much more eventful season than the summer months were,
barring any unforeseen circumstances.
In other news, other big announcements in association with fights that are set to go down this fall, per tweet from Michael Benson. The WBC have announced they've made a special Teotihuacan belt for the Mexican Independence Day this year, but will award it to the winner of Canelo Alvarez versus Caleb Plant on November 6th, as there are no major fights on September 18th. Mike Coppinger tweeted, tickets for the undisputed super middleweight title fight between Canelo Alvarez and Caleb Plant at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas go on sale tomorrow at 10 a.m.
Pacific time.
Barboza Box, by way of his social media account, added that day, Canelo Alvarez versus Caleb Plant as a pay-per-view is going to be going head-to-head with UFC 268, Usman versus Covington 2. And this does pose a problem. I don't want to overstate the role of this potential shared audience. Those hybrid combat fans, that combat contingent that takes in both MMA and boxing cards.
So this could be a problem.
A problem for the PBC, because they insisted on doing this fight instead of sending Caleb Plant across the street and letting DAZN do the fight instead. DAZN offered to do the fight.
It doesn't look like sending Caleb across the street was an option.
I keep telling you guys, it feels like the PBC bit off more than they could chew, trying to handle a fight of this size and a fighter of Canelo Alvarez's stature, guaranteeing him as much money as they guaranteed him. It looks like they've exhausted their resources, and that's not their only problem. They now have to go head-to-head with a UFC pay-per-view, and I don't know how big or how small.
I don't know how big a dent that could put in the buy rate.
Both mixed martial arts and boxing, their fans, they do exist independent of one another. You do have some hybrid fans that take in both cards from both combat sports, both boxing and mixed martial arts. I don't know how big or how small that contingent is, but that is the contingent that will have to make a decision. That is the contingent that will have to make a choice. Do they want to watch a boxing match or a UFC fight?
That's a large contingent, and the PBC's got a problem.
And if it's not, then it's a bit of a misnomer, and they don't have that much to worry about, at least not in reference to that, having to share an audience that might stand divided once it's time to make a purchase. Though when you invest as much as the PBC has invested in this fight, when you go as far as guaranteeing these guys $50 million, $50 million in guaranteed purses, you want to make sure that there are as little bumps in the road as possible. This is a possible bump.
A shared audience.
Another possible bump, possible hiccup, is the pay-per-view model itself. It hasn't been yielding a very big return as of late. Manny Pacquiao versus Yordenis Ugas only did about 250,000 pay-per-view buys per the rumor mill and what it's spinning. And if the name of Manny Pacquiao can at least get you 300,000 buys, what does that say about the pay-per-view model? Manny
is old.
Is in the twilight of his career, unlike Canelo Alvarez. That has a role to play. Yordenis Ugas was a last-minute stand-in opponent, 2 weeks' notice. That has its role to play as well. Canelo Alvarez has hit his stride. He's in his prime. He has a very loyal following. He is in a very different place in his career than Manny Pacquiao was when he fought Yordenis Ugas.
I think that this fight could outperform that fight.
I think it can, though it really won't take much to outperform that fight or Gervonta Davis's last pay-per-view or Errol Spence's last year. I mean, I don't think it'll take much to outperform the kind of pay-per-views the PBC has been putting on, but this is a far more expensive fight than those other fights. Thus, outperforming those pay-per-views ain't enough.
They're going to have to sell a lot of pay-per-views to break even.
Because putting this fight together has costed them substantially more money than all those other fights, all those other cards. They don't break even with this thing. There's going to be a lot of red ink all over the place, and it'll be their own fault because they insisted on doing this fight. They could have sent Caleb Plant across the street and let the fight be DAZN's burden. No, you wanted to put it on.
Well, you got what you wanted.
Though now that we have an official announcement, an official fight date, an official fight poster, the broadcaster for the match hasn't been announced. We don't know if this is going to be a Fox pay-per-view or a Showtime pay-per-view, though most people feel this is going to be a PBC on Fox show. We can start talking about this fight in realistic terms, and what are some things to look out for? What are some things to expect? Characteristically, Caleb Plant is an outside pot shotter, defensively minded guy that fights on the balls of his feet. He's not a prolific puncher, and he's not an artillery guy. Should the man opposite the ring afford him opportunities, he will capitalize on them, but that has more to do with the man opposite the ring and their overall lack of defense, as opposed to Caleb being a gunslinger. A gunslinger is what he ain't.
You can beat a Mike Lee like a drum.
And a Vincent Farfandugan, even a Jose Uzcategui, because none of those guys are as hard to hit as Canelo Alvarez. So the opportunities that you had to capitalize with them, you won't have with Canelo. Perhaps this is why Caleb Plant, who's more of an outside fighter than an inside fighter, decided to enlist the aid of Andre Ward, get some pointers from the man himself, whose bread and butter was in the pocket, deep in the pocket. Ward could fight on the outside if he wanted to, but characteristically, he was more of an inside guy, and that's likely why Caleb Plant went to him, for an element of surprise, another gear that he can hit with Canelo Alvarez.
I don't know how much of a difference that's going to make.
In one camp, for one fight, don't get me wrong, I think that Caleb Plant is a good fighter. I think he's a fighter who's eager to learn. He has to, given the position that he's in right now, fighting a fighter of this caliber, kind of fighter he hasn't fought before.
But Ward's not going to fight the fight for you.
Caleb Plant's best weapon in this fight is likely going to be movement, not artillery. Pivots, shifts, upper body movement, angles, rolling punches off the shoulder, attempting to make Canelo Alvarez miss, and trying to make him pay, which I think is going to be very hard to do because Canelo Alvarez is a bit of a counterpuncher himself, and he's proven that at a much higher level than Caleb.
Canelo's going to stalk Caleb.
Try to get mid-range to inside on this guy. Caleb Plant, in turn, will likely try to fight the fight from the outside, at least in the early goings of it, and he might have some success with that while he's still fresh.
When the pace hasn't caught up to him.
Because I think it will. Canelo Alvarez is a fighter who spent 12 rounds chasing around Arslan Lara. He went 24 rounds with Gennady Golovkin in a high-octane fight, another 12 with Daniel Jacobs. Canelo Alvarez has shown
And grown as a fighter.
that he can make the ring feel like a very small place for the man opposite him. Callum Smith and Billy Joe Saunders found that out very recently, and I have to say that Billy Joe Saunders, to the eye, is a trickier fighter to have to catch up to than Caleb is. And Billy's been in there with better fighters than Caleb has so far, as strange as that might sound. Billy's a southpaw.
Caleb's an orthodox fighter.
There are small similarities there between Billy and Caleb. They're both finesse-fighting guys, hit and not get hit, defensively minded, stick-and-move, feint guys.
Billy's more herky-jerky.
All the same, Billy and Caleb both lean towards the pure boxer end of the spectrum. Neither one of them is all that big a puncher. Neither one of them is an artillery guy. The difference here is Caleb's an orthodox fighter, whereas Billy was a southpaw. Those southpaws, they can make things very tricky, leading with their right and moving to it as they jab, trying to stay on the outside of an orthodox fighter's jab. Canelo ain't got to worry about that with Caleb, because Caleb's an orthodox fighter. I think that Caleb could have some success early, in the early goings of the fight, while he's still fresh. But he's never fought someone that fights at this level before, and I think around the midpoint of the fight, the pace of it will catch up to him. He'll start to tire, and he'll start to get hit, taking clean shots. Clean shots to the body, clean shots to the head. Because it's either you're attempting to pot shot Canelo Alvarez from the outside, which could prove difficult since he knows how to stay off the line, he knows how to be elusive whilst closing the gap. It's either you're trying to box him from the outside, or you're actually engaging him on the inside. The inside don't favor Caleb Plant at all.
No, that's where Canelo wants to be.
So in all likelihood, Caleb will attempt to keep him out, keep him at the end of his jab, which could prove difficult and could prove tiring. Fighting on the fly.
The pace of the Uzcategui fight caught up to him in their fight.
Late in their fight, Jose Uzcategui, God bless him, he ain't no Canelo Alvarez. So if that got you tired...
Imagine what this guy's gonna do to you.
And those are just my preliminary thoughts ahead of this fight.
November 6th.